ドーナツって甘いなの？
甘いのもそのまんまそのものは
甘くない。
甘くないけど挟む生クリームとかチョコクリームとか。
でもなんか鶏のやつみたいな。
ビーガン。ビーガンチキン。
あれは甘くない。
甘くない。
でそのビーガンチキンは、チキンじゃなくてビーガン。
全部ビーガン。
へえ。オッケー。まだ来ます。
はい。
さっき食べたばかり。は
てな大観山全部ローマ字小文字でインスタだけ今やってます。
オッケー。チェックします。ありがとう。
ありがとうございます。
へえ、that's crazy. They got everything. Look at this. They got massage. It's a massage for your lip. Is it a leg massage? It's a massage. I don't know, man. You tell me. Some nice. The cool thing about like Tokyo neighborhoods is actually the back streets. So, you'll notice there's like all kinds of shops. Then you have like residencies. And I was talking to somebody. I'm like a main street guy, so I always take the main streets. And my best friend here, he's a backstreet, not like backstreet kid, but you know, he's a backstreet guy. All right now. So he always takes like these kind of back streets, and like you never know what you're gonna find. Like, you know, there's a lot of cool little shops in Daikanyama, but they're like, you know, not on the main strip. Soybean smoothie, dude. Grilled croissants. Undercover. Sali amor. Why not? We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. My name is Mance Thompson. I'm originally from Michigan. Grew up in St. Louis. My parents owned a company, so we moved around a lot. So I've lived in Virginia, Seattle, St. Louis, Ohio, South Carolina, California, and of course Michigan and Japan. So been around a bit. And I've lived in Japan 21 years, 12 years now in Shibuya. So this is kind of my hometown now. So I hope you enjoy the view. So I'm a photographer. I've been doing photography now. It's actually kind of interesting how I got started. So my sister's husband worked with Obama's first campaign. So she had tickets to the inauguration. And so she's like, you want to go to the inauguration? And I'm like, yeah. So, but I was like, man, this is like a historic occasion. So I was like, I got to get a camera. So I had studied photography like back in the day in high school. And then I'd always had, you know, like 35 millimeter, mostly Canon, over the years. So I was like, okay, I got to get a, you know, DSLR. And so I was like, okay, I need a good camera. So I bought a Canon 50D, which is almost pro level. And I bought it like the day before the inauguration. So I still was like trying to figure out how to use it. And that was my first like digital camera. So that was kind of what got me back into photography. And at the time I was working for an art company here in Japan. But my friend's little brother is like a real famous DJ. And I used to like go to his shows and I'd just bring my camera and take pictures. And then like eventually one day they were like, oh, can you be his, you know, photographer? I was like, cool. So I started like doing a lot of nightlife photography. So like clubs. Close to 10 years, I was like always shooting like DJs, clubs, just like partying, hanging out. And now I'm old, I can't do that anymore. So the last 3 years I've been doing studio photography mostly. So what brought me to Japan? An airplane. No, So let's go back. So when I was a kid, there were a lot of Japanese shows, like Godzilla was on TV, Ultraman was on TV, Gatchaman was on TV, and like Godzilla, so Godzilla stuff. Like there were a lot of like subtle influences. And I remember when we went to Hawaii. I was a kid. I was probably like 6 or 7. I remember coming down the escalator, and like in the lobby, there was a lady dressed up like a geisha, and I just remembered like thinking she was the most beautiful woman in the world. And it was like I was a kid, and then years later, looking through old photos we had, there's a photo of me as a kid with these Japanese ladies. And so I asked my mom, I'm like, what's up with that? And she's like, oh yeah, when we were in Hawaii, these ladies were like, oh, he's so cute, can we take a picture with him? So at our house, there's a picture of me and some like random Japanese ladies we met at the beach. So it's kind of interesting. But what really kind of did it for me was there was a miniseries called Shogun that came out in 1980. And it was like the most popular show on TV. This is like before Karate Kid, before all this kind of stuff. And it sparked this Japan boom. So like Japanese restaurants and bonsai and all these things kind of started becoming popular because of one miniseries. And there was a scene near the end of this very kind of dramatic story about a British ship's captain who's shipwrecked in Japan, and it's actually based on it's based loosely on a true story. There was a guy who was shipwrecked, and he became an advisor to Tokugawa Ieyasu, and he was called Anjin, which means pilot. So he was the captain of this ship. So there's this scene near the climax of the story where all these ninja like sneak into the castle, start just like flipping out, throwing stars, cutting people up, and they actually they set a bomb, and it ends up killing his love interest. So like that, as a 8-year-old kid, seeing that, it just like fascinated me. And I didn't even know what ninja were. I was just like, oh my God, that's the coolest thing ever. It's like, I want to be a ninja. So like from elementary school on, I would like get books about Japan, like about ninja and samurai. And so over the years, I just like started studying about that. So my book project actually started when I was a student. One time I went to this flea market, and this guy was selling posters. And just on a fluke, I asked him if he had any ninja movie posters. And he actually had a poster of Shinobi no Mono, which was the only ninja movie I knew at the time. It was a real famous movie with Ichikara Raizo. And it was expensive though. I was a student, and it was like $100, and I was like, ooh, but I bought it. And then like over the next several years, like whenever I would have money, I would go to these flea markets and buy more posters. And one day I was like, oh, it'd be interesting to look for these movies also. So I started looking around for ninja movies. This is still in the days of VHS. So most of them weren't on DVD, and I started like buying them. At this point, I have actually 80 plus ninja movies, Japanese ninja movies. And I have over 100 posters. And so from there, I started researching the movies and the history. And so that's what got me into thinking about writing a book about this. So that's how I got started. That time on, I just like was really into Japan. So my parents take me to like the little martial arts shop, like down in, at this time we were living in St. Louis. So it was like a Chinese run shop. So they, they had Kung Fu stuff, they had like karate stuff, ninja books and everything. So like I would always just go there and buy books and read up about ninja and samurai. And so basically that was like kind of, it wasn't the best sources, but it was kind of teaching me about Japanese history. Sakanobote, when I was in college, I was an Asian studies major. And I first came to Japan the summer of my sophomore year. and I did a 6-week exchange program at in Hiratsuka at Kanagawa Daigaku. So that's like my first like actual time coming to Japan. And I remember like flying over, like just before we land in Narita, when you cross the ocean and you like finally see land below. And like I remember like the feeling when I saw my first like Japanese style rooftop, and I was just, oh my God, like this is my dream come true. So like that first trip, I fell in love with everything. So you know, like at that time, this is '93, so like Ichigo milk was really popular, strawberry milk, and there were like these like kind of wafer cookies with strawberry on top, and like the parking structures were really so different from America, and like just everything I experienced, I was just like freaked out. So I actually went to karaoke for the first time with some students, and that night with another set of students I went again. So like my first time going to karaoke, I went twice in one day. So that was like really amazing. During this trip, we actually went to Kyoto and we visited this temple called Tofukuji, which is really famous in Kyoto for its koyo, which is like the leaves changing color in the fall. And so that was a great experience, you know. I took classes on like Japanese culture, history, Japanese language. Actually had Japanese language classes too. And then when I got back in the fall, I started taking Japanese in my college. And like the first week I knew everything. I was like raising my hand, answering all the questions. But by like the second week, I was just like, what? It's like a whole nother language. I was like, what's going on? So my whole 6-week language program was actually worth like 1 week of language class. So that was kind of funny. But so I started Japanese that fall, but I only did 1 semester. I ended up dropping it the next semester, and I didn't study it again till the last semester of my senior year. And before that semester started, actually, I was wanting to come back and visit Japan, but you know, I'm a poor student, so I was like trying to figure out how I can get back here. And so I was like, oh yeah, so you know, I had gone to this temple. So the head monk would come visit America every year and give like speeches at Harvard and other universities. He would come to our university too. And so I was like, I asked my professor, Asian religion professor, I was like, oh, you know, do you think I could, if I wrote him, he'd let me visit the temple? So she's like, yeah, you know, you can try. So she wrote me kind of a introduction letter. And so I was able to go back there for my thesis research. So I was actually a monk for 4 days. And you know, in Japan they say mikabozu, which is like someone who like starts something but gives up. And I was actually a yokabozu, so I was a monk for 4 days. So I made it just by 1 day. So that was cool. I got to come back to Japan. And you know, as a monk, you meditate 3 times a day. You do chants in the morning. But for some reason, like even though I hadn't studied Japanese for a while, like I met a woman who was like traveling and visiting the temple, and we were like talking, and somehow it just clicked. So somehow being in a temple and not speaking kind of started making me understand Japanese more. And so then I took 1 more semester of Japanese language when my senior year. So then I worked for 2.5 years for my parents. They owned a company that made car parts at the time. So I was like, God, I hate living, I was in South Carolina at the time. I was like, I hate living down south. You know, Confederate flags everywhere. You know, it's the most boring city. It's a little town. And I was like, I want to get back to Japan. And so this friend of mine from my college days contacted me, and she's like, oh, I might have a way you can move to Japan. I was like, tell me about it. So there's a town near my university in California that had a sister city with this town in Tochigi, about 2 hours north of Tokyo. and they were hiring 6 people to teach English in the junior highs there. So I interviewed for that and got accepted. So I was able to live in Japan so I was able to get accepted in that program, and I lived in Tochigi for 2 years teaching English. So that was my actual first time living in Japan. So I moved back to the States in 2000, and I worked for my parents again, but like this time I was in Ohio, and it's kind of the same thing, boring, and I was missing Japan so much. But I figured out, so I wouldn't lose my Japanese ability, I made friends at the university there. So I would like hang out with them every now and then, and we'd speak Japanese. So that like really helped me maintain some language ability. So finally, after 2 years, I had enough. I was like, I gotta figure out a way to get back to Japan, man. This is ridiculous. So I was looking for language programs, and I was staying at a friend's house on the Tobu-Tojo line. And every day, like on this train, I saw posters, and I'm like, what is that? Like, there's a poster of this beautiful woman with like long hair, and I'm like, is that? I knew it wasn't a photo, I knew it wasn't a painting, but I couldn't figure out what kind of art it was. So finally one day I was like, let me just go check out this exhibit. And as soon as I get to the exhibit, there was a white guy in a suit there, and I was like, okay, that's kind of weird. And then I walked around and figured out it's an art form called kirie, which is paper cutouts. It's a Chinese art form, and this was a Japanese artist who had kind of mastered this technique and turned it from like a kind of a craft, folk craft from China, into like fine art. And so, it was amazing. I understood. I was like, cool, And I was only in Japan for 2 weeks. I was on a shoestring budget. I was just crashing at my boy's place, and I was getting ready to leave. And the guy in the suit came up to me and was like, "Oh well, the artist's wife is coming, and she's doing a book signing, so she'll sign your book if you want." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I was like, "Okay, let me buy a book." And when she got there, I was the first person in line for the book signing, and I was like, I'm moving back here in about 6 months to study Japanese. So she handed me her business card. She's like, oh, good, let's have tea sometime. And I was like, what? I was like, okay. So during the 2 years I was in this language program, I would see her every now and then, and, we would go to dinner, and then, I learned more about her husband's artwork. And then she would have me translate things for her webpage and, visit the other exhibits and things. So, we actually, while I was still a student, they had an exhibit for his work inside the Forbidden City in China. And we actually stayed at the Jiaoyu Tai, which is this, it's a place mostly like politicians can stay at. It's where they held the 6-party talks. I don't know if you remember that, but like North Korea, Japan, and China, and Russia, they had the talks about North Korea. So I actually got to stay there, and we had the reception dinner inside the Hall of the People. So it's just an amazing experience. And that was my first trip to China. So when I graduated this 2-year language program, she hired me. So I worked for her for about 10 years. And we did exhibits of his work, like at Mitsukoshi and other department stores. So I traveled all around Japan doing that. So, yeah. So it's amazing how just random things kind of affect your life and determine where you end up, this year has been crazy, right? So COVID-19 and all these natural disasters, now there's 2 hurricanes coming to America, and on top of the stress of that, we had to witness someone murdering someone on TV, basically. So we actually did 2 marches here. And the first march, at the end, we actually did a moment of silence. And we did it for the same amount of time that this policeman had his knee on George Floyd, which is 8 minutes, 48 seconds, right? And it was so long, just standing there with your eyes closed. And like after about 4 minutes, it starts to like, you start thinking about like, damn, I've had my eyes closed for a minute, you know, like this is a long time. Growing up in America, you experience racism basically from childhood on, and you kind of internalize it. But then one thing will kind of be the straw that breaks the camel's back. So when I was in college in California, the Rodney King incident actually happened the fall before I came out. And so watching this man get beaten, you know, by this gang of cops surrounding him and just beating him mercilessly with batons, it just like, it sent a shockwave through our whole society. And the same thing with George Floyd. So when those kind of things happen, people have like a gut reaction. And it's not about necessarily whether that person is good or not, whether they were committing a crime or not. What people are reacting to is the way that they're treated inhumanely. And just, you know, the other day there was a man in Wisconsin who the police were trying to stop, and he was walking away, and a cop grabs him by the back of his shirt and point blank shoots him 7 times. I think people are just fed up with seeing that, you know, over and over. People take to the street to protest, and people are going to continue to protest this kind of treatment until it's over, till it stops. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, how could you pick someone who's a criminal and protest on their behalf? And it's like, you're missing the point. The point isn't whether or not they're a criminal. If you think about it, all the civil rights activists and leaders were criminals. Martin Luther King was a criminal. Rosa Parks was a criminal, because in those days, the law was that if you're black, you can't, like, for example, if someone white got on a bus, you'd have to move to the back of the bus. That was like the policy. So by defying that policy, you know, she got arrested. All the marchers got arrested. People trying to vote got, you know, beaten and killed. So it didn't matter whether you were obeying the law or breaking the law. The fact was that you were not considered equal. And so when people kind of tried to gain their own rights and their freedoms, you know, people were actually willing to kill them over it. And even today, I mean, my family and most of the people I grew up around were very successful, black people. But it didn't matter how successful you are. If you are a black man or a black woman, for example, driving a nice car, you know, when the cops pull you over, they don't see you as, oh, that's a successful pillar of society. They say, oh, he's probably a drug dealer. So, you know, even to this day, that's what we go through in America. And I mean, black people have been fed up since the 60s. For example, the Black Panthers, their whole point in like the Watts riots, the whole point was that police brutality was an issue. And that was in the 1960s. And it's 2020, and we're still dealing with police brutality and how people of color are treated differently. I just saw a video. So there was a black man who was walking to a convenience store holding a knife, and he was shot in the back by police. And just the other day I see a video of a white man walking a dog, brandishing this long knife, and 2 police women go into this little shop in New York, and he follows them in, and he's like belligerent. He's brandishing his weapon. He tried to steal cigarettes, and then when he was disarmed, he actually pushed one of the police women, and about 8 police came out, you know, and it was like they were bending over backwards not to shoot this guy, and he was like begging them to shoot him by his actions, and he finally got shot, but it took, you know, several minutes of interaction, whereas a black guy just trying to walk into a store automatically shot in the back, no questions asked, no brandishing, no, you know. So that's what people are upset about. It's that we are not treated equally, even in 2020 in our country. So this whole movement in the past has mostly been people of color. Nowadays, even white people are fed up and they're like, we've had enough of this, you know, enough is enough, and so they're protesting and trying to make change. But the problem is that you have protesters, but then you have people who are looting and rioting, and the average person who doesn't think deeply puts them all in the same category. And they're actually different groups of people, but they think, oh, Black Lives Matter means, you know, you're anti-white or you're anti-police. It doesn't mean that at all. We're just saying that our lives matter too. So how is that anti-police, you know? And then it's like when people say all lives matter to protest Black Lives Matter, it just doesn't make sense, because if you believe all lives matter, you should be able to say Black Lives Matter, because all includes black as well. But it's, for example, when you say all lives matter, it'd be like if I'm your neighbor and your house is burning down, and I come outside and look at you crying, like lamenting the fact that your house is burning down, and I say, oh man, all houses matter. It's like way beyond the pale. It's like you're missing the point. So that's kind of my take on things. My cousin just posted this short story to Facebook today, and I thought it was pretty interesting, so I'm gonna read it to you. This is from Daryl Watts, my cousin in Detroit. A small child was walking through his neighborhood one Saturday morning. It was a sunny, quiet morning, and he had time on his hands, so he decided to observe all the different insects he encountered. He saw bees, flies, caterpillars, ants, butterflies, etc. You name it, he saw it. Some of the insects he would feed, some he would play with, and some he would completely ignore. The boy then came across a pair of grasshoppers. He decided he did not like grasshoppers, so he stepped on them. As he continued his day, he also continued to encounter different species of insects. Again, many he would play with, feed, and so on. But whenever he saw grasshoppers, he would kill them. At this time, an older woman had observed the boy and decided to engage him. She asked the boy, "Why are you killing all the grasshoppers?" The child happily acknowledged the woman and said, "I like insects, but I don't like the grasshoppers, so when I see them, I step on them." The woman then said, "But grasshoppers matter." The little boy replied, "All insects matter." And then he stepped on another grasshopper. But I think in the past, things would flare up, and then it would just, like, people would protest, a few things would change, and then it would go back to normal. But I think today, like, people aren't going to stand for that anymore, and that if things don't change now, I really wonder if America can last as a country, because society is so polarized and just the tension is so heightened that I don't think things can ever get back to normal unless there's you know, sea level change. In the art company I worked for, my boss had, at one point, she had like 100 kinds of Chinese tea. So I would drink Chinese tea at work all the time. And she started teaching me how to, you know, the intricacies of using the teapots and gaiwan, which is like it's a cup/teapot, but it's a lidded pot, as opposed to just like a regular teapot. So that's kind of how I got started. And then I found this tea shop in Nakameguro called Ganchabo, which has the best tea in Japan, best Chinese tea. which is a kind of oolong tea called yencha or gancha in Japanese from Wuyi, Mount Wuyi. And so when I lived in Meguro, I lived down the street from this tea shop. And so I used to go there as a customer all the time. And then one day, I think I'd been going there maybe 8 years or something. I'd even made trips to China with them to get Chinese tea in the fall. And one day I walked in and they were like, oh yeah, the price of the tea has gone up like 4 times. And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, you know. So I was like, oh my God, there goes my tea habit. But at the time I had already started my photography company, and you know, I still had like free time during the week, some certain days, especially during the day because I work more at night. So they were like, oh, you know, you can work here if you want. And I was like, perfect, because I've always thought about running a tea shop at some point, like when I get older. And this was a way to learn the business, and it's also a way to drink tea for free. So I started working there, and I worked there till almost till, like, you know, basically when COVID started earlier this year. So I've made I think four trips to China to buy tea, and it's amazing because, you know, it's healthy, tastes great, and it's actually a good way to learn culture. So like, the difference between me and I think a lot of people who live in Japan who maybe come here to study or come here for work is that I was an Asian studies major and I was interested in Japanese culture since childhood. So when you study something like tea, for example, you actually are able to learn culture and history deeper because, like, for example, in China, you know, tea was kind of widespread since the Tang Dynasty, right? So like Nara period in Japan, it's gone through changes over time. So like the Japanese tea ceremony using matcha, which is tea that's been, you know, finely ground, that actually came from China around the 12th century. That was the way tea was drunk back then. That was a popular way of drinking tea. So that came to Japan and became, you know, more focused on the ceremonial aspects. So like by drinking tea and learning about tea, you actually learn about, you know, history, about religion. In China, tea was actually more valuable than even horses. So like if you stole a horse, you'd get a life sentence. But if you stole tea, it was automatically execution. So like that kind of history is real interesting. And then it ties to modern history in that, you know, the British Empire, the British were so enamored with tea, basically since the 17th century on. And China was such a closed society to trade. They didn't want any British goods. They only wanted silver. So by Britain buying so much tea, there was a drain on silver. And that led to them going to Singapore, starting Singapore. Also affected clippers, which were the ships. They had to develop faster and faster ships so they could bring tea to market, because in those days tea would go bad quicker. And then when you think about that, you know, like the Boston Tea Party in America, starting the Revolutionary War with Britain, you know, that was one of the straws that broke the camel's back. So there was actually a tax put on tea. It's called the Tea and Stamp Act, or it might be called the Stamp Act. Well, but at any rate, so there was a tax put on tea. And so like the colonists in America rebelled against this high price put on tea. And so tea actually affected, you know, there were the opium wars with China and Britain, but then it also affected, you know, Americans' independence. So like after water, tea is the most drunk beverage. And it's really deep when you start looking at the history. So it's not just something you can drink and enjoy, but like as you as you enjoy it, you can learn about the world and about history. And since we're talking about racism and racial issues in America, so like Britain finally went to India and Sri Lanka and started growing tea there. They actually had a British guy dress up like a Chinese person and try to smuggle out tea seeds and tea plants. And he was successful in that, and they grew and they planted them in India and started growing tea there. The tea plantations there, their whole format was based on slave plantations in America. So like even something as simple as tea is intertwined like with all these things we're talking about. So it's fascinating, and I hope more people get into drinking tea, because the health aspects are really great, and it's just a deep thing. In the modern world, we spend so much time like sitting down, like in front of our computers. So like even with me with photography, you shoot for an hour, you maybe have an hour or more in front of the computer editing photos and sending them out. So one thing that keeps me Genki, of course I drink tea while I'm doing all my work, but I also, do martial arts. So like, especially during COVID, since the dojo's been closed, I'll go up on the roof and I'll get my sword out or a practice spear out, and I'll practice martial arts on the roof. So things like that help keep me Genki. And also, talking with friends. So those are the things that keep me Genki. I think Japan is a great country to live in, and I hope more people really learn about like Japan's history and culture and come to live here and visit here, because it's one of the greatest countries to live in the world. The people are nice, food is great. It's a little hot, but even in the summer, they have all these fireworks festivals, and they have the best fireworks in the world. And there's racism here also, but it's like very mild, and it's things that are more like an inconvenience. It's not like you're worried for your life, like when you meet the cops here, you're not worried that you're gonna get shot, So I definitely recommend Japan, and I hope more people come check it out.